Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey everyone, welcome to the Figured Outcast for February 2019. I'm Adam. How are you? What's up? So, if you're brand new to this podcast, you've never heard it before, this is a Patreon podcast. However, it is also available to the public. It first goes out to Patreon backers almost a month early, and then eventually is public. So, if you'd like to get this early as well as all my content, by all means, feel free to sign up at the patreon.com/Adam Koralik. Links in the description. Also, as a quick reminder, I now have a Discord you guys can join as well. That's absolutely free for everybody. Link to in the description as well for that and all the other social stuff. We're going to talk about a whole host of subjects. They're in the description. There's time code provided, so you can switch around if anything interests you more or less. So one thing I want to try here is last month I did this podcast. It was a lot shorter because I had the flu, so I really wasn't able to go very long. But you guys actually seem to like it being shorter, so I thought first, let's experiment with that a bit. I'll ask you guys straight up, is that true? Do you guys prefer it to be shorter? Because usually the runtime was like an hour, but the last one was like 35 minutes. So you guys tell me what you think. With that being the case, we're doing a little experiment here. This one will probably be a little bit shorter. That's just a question. I'm going to have a couple questions for you guys as we go on out. But this first subject isn't really so much a subject as much as it is just kind of a recommendation here. If you enjoy the idea of having me do podcasts, if you like listening to me talk about stuff like this, I also want to point out another podcast I was on recently. I was on GamerTag Radio. My buddy Danny, he had a podcast, and I was on it. We mostly talked about Dreamcast and stuff. I'll put a link to it in the description as well. It was mostly promoted through Twitter. But yeah, you can check it out. A lot of it is just talking about Sega and their history and Dreamcast and all that kind of stuff. So it was a fun conversation to have. So I hope you guys, if you have any interest at all, you can go ahead and pursue that. But so next thing though, I know we're kind of rapid fire here, but I have a question for you guys. So lately, there's been a lot of changes going on regarding my channel and aspects of my life and all these things. And I had one question for you guys, which was, would you guys be more interested if I started pursuing having more game footage content? I'm sure people who've been watching me for a long time know the channel is primarily videos of where you see me and I'm discussing a subject or I'm showing a product or something like that. There's not really game reviews per se. The closest you ever get to that really is the Dreamcast videos, where I occasionally will show one game in particular, but even then I don't, it's not really a game review so much as it is like I'll talk about the game and then give some first impressions. But I've never done like a live stream of like, I'm going to sit down everybody and we're going to play Resident Evil 2 or something. Like, I've never done that. And I'm curious what you guys think about the idea of that coming from me. Would that interest you? Would you like to see things like that? I don't know if I would really feel up to the challenge of reviewing games per se, because I don't know if I trust my own I trust my own ability to analyze, say, a film and tell you why I think it's good or bad. But with a video game, like, I can give you typically surface reasons. I'm not sure I necessarily always would get down in the dirt and, spend the kind of time it would require to do seriously in-depth reviews like a lot of people do, mostly because I have so many other things going on. But I guess what I'm saying is I could do more stuff with in-game content, and I'm curious what you guys think about that. Is that something that you would be in favor of, or would that be like, no, fuck it, this channel is never supposed to have that? Like, I don't know, that's why I'm trying to gauge you guys and see what your interest is. So if you guys could give me any feedback about that, that would really be appreciated. But moving on. We're going to talk very briefly about this, the Super Bowl, the congratulations to the team that won the Handegg competition. I believe it was the Patriots. I don't follow football. It's not my sport. Even I'm from Chicago, and even though the Bears like almost came close, like I didn't care when they lost. It just was like, all right, whatever. Like I like my sports. I like basketball a lot, as I'm sure a lot of you guys know. Hockey and baseball I can get behind if at least if it's the hometown pride thing. Like I couldn't just sit there and watch two teams I have no stake in. But basketball I could probably do that. But football, like, oh, I'd rather watch paint dry. Like I can't. But I guess congratulations to, again, I think it's the Patriots. Although from every meme I've seen on the internet, it seems like they're like the most hated team in the NFL or something like that. I don't know enough about it, so I can't really say. But okay, whatever. But now let's get on to a subject that I think you guys are actually going to be a lot more interested in. So, today, well, okay, by the time most of you hear this, has kind of been around for a bit. Interestingly, so Xbox has been doing a lot with their brand. They've been talking about it for a while now. Last year at E3, they talked about how the Xbox One, service would be available to different devices. They would be working on next generation hardware as well as working on some sort of phone service. And it's interesting. We're getting a little bit more details about it now. I mean, I think this was more of a leak than it was, an official announcement because there wasn't many details provided by it. But essentially, Xbox One is expanding its service to other devices, iOS and Android. And then the thing that really got people a lot of surprise was Switch. So essentially what they're saying is Xbox Live will appear on these things. Now, we don't know exactly what that means yet. Although, what's funny is I made a prediction like this many times over the years. I think going all the way back to right early on when that generation started, when this generation started, I was saying that I think that I think I even have this old video around the time that in 2013 where the consoles launched, and I think I said something to the effect of I think that next time Microsoft's going to do an all digital platform and they're going to try to be like a Steam competitor. Now that was partially right because it sounds like they're still going to be doing hardware, but they are trying to get Xbox as a brand, as a service into other devices. And I think I even said it might even appear as an app, on the PlayStation or whatever Nintendo hardware exists at the time, which to an extent sounds like that's the case because if it's appearing on Switch, then there's an argument for that. Now, what does this mean? Well, a lot of people will argue what this means is that, Microsoft's done with consoles, whatever. No, I do believe, and my position has changed on this because obviously you can get some things right, but you'll get a lot wrong in a prediction. I believe now that what's more likely is Microsoft's going to continue to do hardware, but they're going to continue to expand the brand of Xbox to go beyond hardware for future-proofing, because I'm sure that they don't have interest in pursuing hardware indefinitely. But keeping the Xbox name and brand alive as some sort of service is probably much more viable and certainly more affordable. So getting it onto things like Switch and all that is good for them. You'll notice that PlayStation was omitted from this. And I think part of the reason for that is that they see PlayStation as more of a legitimate competitor. It's something they have to go head-to-head against, whereas they don't see the Switch audience as theirs because Switch, Nintendo in general, tends to appeal to more of an everybody kind of thing and typically goes off and is in its own corner. So people will, pick between a PS4 and an Xbox One, but also have a Switch. And I know that was the plan with the Wii U. It didn't work out, but it did work with the Wii. And so I'm sure from Microsoft's perspective, it's we have no interest in the handheld market. They've never been in there. So they'll put, whatever the equivalency of the Xbox handheld service would be is essentially this. It's putting Xbox Live into iOS, Android, and Switch, all portable entities. That to me seems like what they're doing with that. And the idea, if I could guess, down the road is hey, if you're part of the Xbox ecosystem, you can play with Xbox anywhere. So, your games will be available at home on your Xbox console, your new console. It'll also work if you have an Xbox One X, it'll work through a streaming service, meaning the Xbox One X is powerful enough to run their streaming service, but doesn't necessarily do any of the home local hardware stuff. But also you can get a very low spec version that's basically just a streaming service that can operate through your phone. It can operate through your Switch, and you'll be able to continue to play whatever game you picked up on all these devices. If I had to guess, I'd say that's the direction they're going with it. So that'll be interesting to see if that's actually true and see how that unfolds, because it sounds like they're trying to appeal to everybody at the same time, which could be successful or very confusing. Because let's say that what I just said is correct, and that's what they're planning to do. That would appeal to me because there will be a next generation of physical hardware that does all the local processing, is not stream dependent, and has its own set of games. While those set of games might still exist in a digital form, someone who owns an Xbox One X or owns a Switch or whatever, or even just a phone, if they're digitally doing everything, they'll be able to play those same games and that same experience just slightly differently. Now, it's cannibalistic for guys like me because the more they do that, the more digital it goes, which I don't want, but I recognize is completely inevitable. So that's actually the smart way to do it if you want to get to what they tried to achieve at the beginning of this generation with that DRM, always online version of the Xbox One that no one was in favor of. This way you give it the option without it really being an option. Is everyone's going to eventually ingratiate themselves with digital. and be like, well, okay, I'll sign up for this account and then all my stuff just works on my phone. You know what? Fuck it. I don't need to buy the new box. I don't need to buy the new games because I have Xbox Gold and I have Xbox Game Pass or whatever. And so all my games work here. And then there won't be that extra voice that's upset about a console always being online or whatever the case might be, which is the way you do it. You slowly roll out things like that. And so I recognize that this next generation will probably be the last one that I will be part of. Partially because of that, also partially because of my age. You know, like there's only so long you can do stuff like that. But that'll be interesting to see. I think we're like probably a year or two away from the launch of the next generation of consoles. That will probably last like 5 or 6 years maybe. And then, you know, I'll be almost 40 and might not care anymore. You know, who knows? But yeah, it's hard to say, man, down the road. But that's the way I kind of see it rolling out for them, is that I think that they're probably taking the most fourth dimensional look at that generation, because they're also the ones kind of shaping it, in the way that that system works. Now, of course, they'll have to deal with, I think most of their calculations are based on current internet models within the United States. I think they're not factoring in the rest of the world all that much. Certainly not Japan. But maybe that's to their advantage because they've never been able to do anything in Japan, so why even pretend like they can anymore? Europe is always an X factor for them, but again, that's Microsoft. Like, they know where they work, and I guess that's just the way they're going to pursue it, is most likely North America. So, I mean, Canada will be included in that, but yeah, that's just kind of the way I see it going down. I mean, what do you guys think? You know, you tell me. And we'll talk a little bit more about Sony in a minute, but before we do that, we got a round of shout outs here. All the following people are Patreon backers, and I want to thank them all so much for their support. Every one of them is at the appropriate level in which they get a shout out. If you are not a Patreon backer, I highly advise you, recommend you, ask you, if you will, to join up at any given time. You can get early access to content. You can get a shout out. You can choose subjects. You can even be on this show if you want to be. All the options are over there. Anyway, the round of shout outs go to Justin Webb, Corey Marsh, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Luis Bonilla, Michael Kelly, Eric Perales, Trey Wagner, and Tim Inman. Thank you guys so much once again to Justin Webb, Corey Marsh, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Luis Bonilla, Michael Kelly, Eric Perales, Trey Wagner, and Tim Inman. You guys are all awesome. Thank you so much for everything. But moving on to the next bigger subject of discussion here is PS5 getting possible total backwards compatibility. So we were talking more about what's coming up in the next generation. I don't have much to say about Nintendo just yet, but we'll address that in a second. But to focus on Sony, obviously, the big rumor going around right now is the idea that the PlayStation 5 might have complete backwards compatibility with PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, and PlayStation 4. Now, this isn't actually a new rumor. This has actually been floating around for a while. But what makes this one, the reason it was updated, is I believe it was Sony Japan, through Mark Cerny of all people, actually filed a patent specifically for this. Now, on the surface, that sounds like that's exciting. Now, you have to understand, patents get filed all the time and don't amount to anything. A lot of the time, patents like that are made just to protect a company's interests so that no one else can do it. That's really all that could be. Now, it's exciting potentially because of what it could mean, but it doesn't actually mean anything in of itself. But the description I've read, if this is to be believed, if this is the way the patent actually would work, is it almost would use an FPGA style technology within the console, rather than write emulators for PS5 that work with the previous 4-generation consoles. It essentially has an FPGA that's, I don't know if it's rewritable exactly or exactly how that works, but it essentially has just a piece of hardware in it that's designed to completely replicate another piece of hardware. So the FPGA would represent or replicate PS4, another one possibly for PS3, another one for PS2, and another one for PS1. In essence, completely, the PS5 in of itself can't read those games. So if it detects one, it just switches on the appropriate FPGA, and then that runs the game. So that, if that's actually how it works, it's a unique trick for a major technology company to do, because typically FPGAs are done by like third-party companies that make, I'm not gonna say clone consoles exactly, but they are, and they aren't. Like the AVS, which was technically a clone console NES that uses an FPGA to replicate NES hardware, but does it better. FPGAs are pretty neat pieces of technology in concept, especially when executed correctly. They're not like your typical NOAC clone technology. and the ones I've used, I've quite enjoyed. It's not, but you know, if Sony was doing this directly, you have to assume they'd probably do it rather well. And if this is true, let's just assume this is true. Let's assume it's happening. That is amazing. If the PS5, because it would also suggest that the PS5 is therefore a physical disc-based console, or at least has a disc drive for PS1 through 4, even if PS5 for whatever reason doesn't use physical discs, although I would bet that it does. That would be super exciting to a guy like me who's just like, oh shit, that would be awesome. My entire PlayStation library works on this one machine. And to see what it could do, you know, with especially PlayStation 2 stuff, and see how well it could clean that up, I would be really, really curious about that. And just see what kind of tech is in there to clean those things up. PS1, you got to believe they could clean up very easily. I mean, they've been doing that since PS2, technically. So I don't think there's any problem there. PS2 itself has always been kind of a pain in the ass, and everybody's kind of clamoring to make it look better. And there's all these like little tricks to slightly improve it here and there, but nothing as good as Sony possibly making essentially an upgraded version. PlayStation 3, I never really felt needed it too much, but it's, you know, there's definitely room for improvement, obviously. And it'll be interesting to see if they can actually truly replicate that, because PlayStation 3 was a very unique piece of technology, and so it's replicating it would be theoretically very expensive. But if they're, you know, just tinkering with throwing a fucking FPGA in there and it works, then I'm, you know, hey, why not? If they got that to work, that's impressive. And then PS4, I don't think would be as big of a problem, because you have to assume that the PS5 is probably just basically taking the architecture of the PS4 and just kind of upgrading every little aspect of it. So it's essentially just already going to be backwards compatible regardless. It was just basically like, I'm not a super tech dude, you know, that's not my field, but you have to imagine that almost every part in there is just an upgraded version of what's already in the PS4 or the PS4 Pro. So that one probably would have happened anyway. But yeah, I will be very curious to see where that goes and how that works, and I'll be very excited about it too if that's actually true, because yeah, again, like I'm the physical media guy, you know. I was just talking about like why that I have that fear with the Xbox One, even though it's inevitable. I love the idea that Sony would kind of keep it going at least for one more round, you know. But then of course it begs the question, you know, would Microsoft do that as well? I mean, they obviously could. I mean, this generation, they're the clear winners of backwards compatibility. I mean, they have their own, the Xbox One ecosystem. They have the Xbox 360 to an extent ecosystem, and then a very limited amount of original Xbox in there. But the fact that they do that and no one else does is impressive, because Nintendo doesn't offer you any sort of backwards compatibility currently, and Sony doesn't really either currently. They have the option to buy digital versions of PlayStation 2 games running via an emulator, but that's not really the same thing. Granted, the Xbox One system is far from perfect in the backwards compatibility, as far as backwards compatibility goes. So the idea that if one of them does it, and it sounds more like Sony would be, that maybe Microsoft would do that too, having all your generations of one console there, that would be really nice. But yeah, that's kind of all my thoughts on that particular thing. So just a quick little throw in there about... well, I guess I should say, if I'm going to call predictions on that, we talked more about what the Xbox prediction is. With Sony, it sounds like their route is going to be more dependent upon the PlayStation as like its history as a total package. Because if that's the case, they're not selling you something that's going to work on your phone and it's going to do all that stuff. They're selling you on like everything PlayStation is here in one box. You can play it all. Bam. And that's a major pull. That would actually be really cool for the retro market too, because it would give it a new breath of life for people to go out and like rediscover stuff from, you know, 20, 30 years ago, and, you know, put it in there and just be like, wow, I can actually play this again. Well, more like 30 years by the time this thing's out. Actually, no, it wouldn't even be that far, would it? Because it's been like 25 years or so since the launch of, like 25 years or so since the launch of PS1. So yeah, damn, time flies. It was 94, I believe, in Japan. So yeah, it hasn't been quite 30 years, but yeah, we'll see, man. It's still cool to at least 25 years. Let's say at least 25 years of coverage, all coming under one console. Now you have to expect exceptions in there, like it doesn't sound like PlayStation Portable in any way would be covered, or PlayStation Vita. Also, you got to believe there's going to be individual games that don't work for whatever reason. I don't have any specific examples, obviously. I do recall that there were certain PS2 games that I don't remember them offhand. Some people have pointed these out to me in the past, saying there's certain PlayStation 2 games that do not work on PlayStation 3 because they required some of the extra hardware of the PS1 that was in the PS2, as confusing as that sentence is, in order to run. And the PS3 lacked that, so they didn't work in the first place. So I wonder if it'll be a similar situation where there's going to be like 99% of the games work, but there's going to be a couple of oddballs here and there that don't. One other thing that would be really cool is if they stripped out region coding. God, that would be nice, because imagine the ability to just, hey, all these Japanese games, all these European games, at least if you're saying this from the perspective of being in North America, open to you now. That would be really neat, to be able to get those imports and stuff and not have to deal with region coding. That would be really useful with, especially, obviously, PlayStation 1 and 2. That would just be really nice. So yeah, here's hoping that that's the case. When it comes to Nintendo, though, hard to say. I mean, obviously they're killing it right now, and every conventional wisdom always seems to defy them, but it seems to work in their favor because everything that seems to make sense doesn't apply to them. A lot of things about the Switch don't make sense, and yet it destroys the market. It's amazing. So it's hard to even ever really predict them or make any sort of call. They just don't add up, to be quite frank. I don't think that Nintendo has any intention of dropping new hardware anytime soon. Maybe some sort of slightly upgraded version of the Switch, a la the new Nintendo Switch. With slightly upgraded this and that. It might become more viable soon for them to have 64 gigabyte carts instead of 32 gigabyte carts, which is what they're currently limited to. I would really hope for that, because there's a lot of games. I mean, it was always a bottleneck, and it still is, but at least that would open it up a little more, and not be so dependent upon having internal storage. But beyond that, I don't think they have any plans anytime soon. But they're free to do as they like. At some point, I believe that they too will have some sort of upgraded hardware as a new console, but we're talking years away. And they'll probably stick with this model of like, let's just keep our home console and portable console ecosystems combined and unified, and just do it that way, because that's obviously working for us. And then they'll just make some other change here and there. Maybe this backwards compatibility thing will absolutely crush it for both Sony and Microsoft, and even Nintendo will acknowledge that. I mean, if anybody could do backwards compatibility just amazing, it would be Nintendo, given their history of everything they've ever produced. I don't think they would do it, though, because Nintendo also has the unique advantage of being able to resell you constantly on their back catalog, which they've proved multiple times, not only with game re-releases and franchise re-releases, but also PlayStation or Nintendo Classic, SNES Classic, etc. They don't need to do that. But the idea that the next generation of Nintendo hardware, because I doubt they would do this on Switch specifically, but the next generation of Nintendo hardware having an optional like USB dock or something where it's got an NES cart slot, an SNES, an N64, as well as some sort of disk drive that's able to read GameCube, Wii U, and of course, Switch cards, maybe even a GBA slot and a DS slot, who knows. But to see all that in one place would be ridiculous, through an official means, not through like some Retron type of thing. But that's getting way ahead of ourselves. That's fantasy at this point, so hard to say. But yeah, that's kind of it as far as like PS5 backwards compatibility goes. I do think that if that happens, it'll just be awesome. So moving on. Next subject here. We talked briefly about the Super Bowl, which I didn't care about. One of the only things about the Super Bowl that I like is that, of course, like anybody in nerddom, you do get the occasional like new trailer for something big that's coming up. There were new Avengers spots and Captain Marvel spots and things like that, but I didn't watch them because I'm kind of trying to avoid them at this point, because less is more. I'd kind of like to go into those a little more fresh. But one that I did see was the new Toy Story 4 trailer, which just kind of featured Buzz at like a carnival, which was kind of cool. I do want to see Toy Story 4 just for the sake of it. Fun fact about me, I've seen every Disney Pixar movie in theaters. I mean the actual Pixar ones, not all CGI movies, not everything by DreamWorks or whatever, or even the stupid spin-off ones that have nothing to do with Pixar but people think do, like Planes. I never saw that shit. But the ones actually made in-house by Pixar, which is almost all good. And then, of course, you have the occasional dud like Cars 2 or The Good Dinosaur, which was basically unwatchable. Stuff like that. But Toy Story 4 I would go see anyway for that reason, just to kind of keep it up. I mean, I saw the first Toy Story when I was a kid, and I've seen every one of them since. But the plot of this apparently is kind of weird. It's the idea that, you know, what if a kid made a little toy out of, like, you know, a fork and some glue and some confetti or whatever, and, like, would it achieve sentience in the world of Toy Story? Apparently, yes. That's all we really know about it. But I saw somebody online pitch an alternate version of Toy Story 4 that he's like, this is what they should have made. And basically, I agreed. The premise was, you know, Toy Story 4 really should have been Andy, you know, in his, like, late 30s or mid or early 30s even. You know, maybe about 10, 15 years after that, the movie we just, after Toy Story 3, which would be almost age appropriate at this point, I think. Basically becoming very nostalgic and becoming a collector, which is very appropriate for me, and trying to basically rebuy his childhood. Now, we differ on that, A, because I never really got rid of anything, and, you know, that's not why I collect stuff, but I see that, and I know that from, you know, doing years of YouTube and with game collecting. It's like a lot of people are motivated by, hey, you know, I had the N64 when I was a kid and I had like 4 games, but then I traded them all to GameStop when the PS2 was coming out, and I regret it because, you know, it gave me some money to get a PS2 and then whatever, but now I miss all those N64 games. I got to go out and find them again. That's obviously applying it to video games, but, you know, people do that for toys. You know, people do that for any number of things. And if they were to do that storyline, that would be very interesting because, you know, it would partially be, does he just try to get the actual same toys back, or just very similar ones, like a different Buzz Lightyear? Or, you know, does he end up with one of them and not one of the others? You know, like, I feel like that would be a more fascinating story. But at the same time, to be fair to this movie, obviously I haven't seen it. I'm just projecting what I feel like would make sense. But of course, I'll give this Toy Story 4 a chance. And it's not like you couldn't eventually do the Toy Story 5 with that storyline, potentially, I guess. I don't know exactly how this one will pan out. But yeah, to me, that would have been a cool way to go. Maybe it still will be. Who knows? But yeah, that said, the actual Toy Story 4 trailer in of itself, it didn't really offer me much to go on, except that they're at some sort of carnival or something, and I don't really know why. But that might be the point. Maybe they're trying to keep it vague at this point. I don't know. But either way, I'm going to see it, so whatever. Next up. So I've been playing a lot of Resident Evil stuff lately. Funny enough, I have not played the Resident Evil 2 remake yet. I intend to do that. I just got this, like, nostalgia, like we were just talking about. I got this bug, man. I really wanted to play Resident Evil 2 for Dreamcast. The original version. Well, okay, the Dreamcast version was one of the later adaptations, but you get what I'm saying. I wanted to play that game before Resident Evil 2 Remake came out. And then I decided, well, if I'm going to do it, I kind of want to do it right. So I ended up playing through Resident Evil Origins Collection on PS4, both Zero and the Remake, that were both originally GameCube versions, but I played the PS4 version. Then I did the 3 Dreamcast games. I did the Resident Evil 2 Dreamcast, then 3 Nemesis, and then Code Veronica, which was originally made for the Dreamcast. Fun thing about Resident Evil 2 on Dreamcast is that, aside from the patched PC version, Resident Evil 2 Dreamcast is generally considered the best version, except for this odd red tint that just exists in the game that they couldn't get rid of. It should have been the GameCube version. The GameCube version should have been better. It has better load times, and it has, of course, just one disc. But aside from that, it doesn't really have any advantages. I mean, the Dreamcast version runs in progressive scan. It runs at 40p. The GameCube version doesn't do that. If it did, you know, game over. It wins. The Dreamcast version also has full-size cutscenes where the GameCube version does not. So it's odd. It's very odd, but yeah, so I played it on Dreamcast is my point, and quite loved that game. I remember it so well, and I really love playing it again. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, I didn't remember all that well. I remembered aspects of it, so playing it again was nice, and, you know, I was like, oh yeah, okay, that's what this game was about. All right, I enjoyed that. Funny thing about that game is that it was originally supposed to be just a spin-off game. It wasn't supposed to be like an actual third entry in the franchise. It was actually Code Veronica for the Dreamcast that was supposed to be the third entry in the franchise, but because Capcom was all gung-ho about the Sega Dreamcast, like that, they loved that machine. I mean, if you look at the games on the Dreamcast, some of the biggest third-party supporter as far as quality content goes was definitely Capcom. It was like, a lot of people even think a lot of the best games that Capcom made were actually made by Sega, but no, Capcom made them. Like, they were in love with that system, and so they wanted Resident Evil 3 to be like one of the big Dreamcast pushes, but they couldn't because they had this older deal with Sony that said, like, the third one has to be on a PlayStation. And so they had no choice but to basically swap the names. I mean, I shouldn't say swap the name, but at least swap and put a number on the third one. So rather than have it be Resident Evil Code Veronica, it probably would have been Resident Evil 3 Code Veronica, and then instead of it being Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, it would have been Resident Evil Nemesis. So they just put a 3 on the one and not on the other. But yeah, then I of course went ahead and played Nemesis, or sorry, Code Veronica, which is a very good game. I hadn't played that one all the way through in a long time, man. The unfortunate part about that game, though, is that the Dreamcast version that we got in North America was not the final version. There was a, I don't know if you call it a complete edition, that was actually on Dreamcast, but only in Japan. And that version is what was known as Code Veronica X, and made available to the GameCube and the PlayStation 2. And then eventually that version is what was digitally re-released, I believe, on Xbox 360 and possibly PS3. And that game hasn't had a new release this generation, surprisingly, yet. But I'm sure that's inevitable, or at least through backwards compatibility at some point. Then, of course, I went on to play Resident Evil 4. And that was actually, I hadn't played any aspect of Resident Evil 4 since maybe 2006, something like that. Because when I first tried Resident Evil 4, I really wasn't a fan. I didn't like a lot of the changes to it, and it didn't quite work for me. But this time I just was like, you know what? I'm going to do this. I'm going to play it all the way through. And I played the Xbox One version, and it was good. It wasn't great. I liked it, but it was, kind of just, I got through it. I like the merchant guy to an extent. It was okay, but whatever. Then I went on to play Resident Evil 5, which I really didn't enjoy. And then I started playing Resident Evil 6, and suddenly I missed Resident Evil 5 because Resident Evil 6 was just... I even posted about it on Twitter after I finished that game. I wrote, I just finished Resident Evil 6. I need a shower, because I didn't feel good after playing it. I was like, ugh, this is just Michael Bay, the game. I really didn't like it. Then I've been playing at the time I record this, I'm about to finish Resident Evil 7, and while that game has almost no connection whatsoever to previous lore, except, in fact, the only connection I found was like one blurb about it, and you're in this part of the house and you read this magazine, and it just mentions how this is like the 18th anniversary of the Raccoon City incident. I'm like, that's about the only acknowledgement I've noticed that has anything to do with previous games. And I feel like at the time they made it, the franchise really needed that. It needed to get away from what had become Resident Evil. It became this weird action-oriented like cartoon, and it just was like, dude, you were a survival horror series. How did you turn into this schlock? And yeah, I'm glad they've recognized that problem, and obviously they fixed it a lot with Resident Evil 2 Remake, because people are praising that one up and down. I played the 30-minute one-shot, and I thought it was phenomenal, and I just haven't gotten around to getting it yet. But yeah, so yeah, I've been playing a lot of Resident Evil stuff lately, and just kind of revisiting that franchise and just being super excited about it. It's been a lot of fun to really go back and replay those. And it's interesting because a lot of people are saying, hey, where's the Resident Evil 3 remake? And that's inevitable. I mean, rumors of that have already kind of leaked and been talked about for a while, but somebody pointed out to me that the reason that that's mostly inevitable is that Resident Evil 3 is now the only game that doesn't run on this one particular engine that Capcom uses, as far as Resident Evil content, or well, main series Resident Evil content goes. Because obviously, things like Survivor or Dead Aim or the, what was that one for the Wii? Wesker's Report, whatever. They're not really counting the spinoffs, although Wesker's Report was made late enough that it probably does run on this engine, but that's not the point. Of the main series games, Resident Evil 3 is the only one that's, basically just has to be emulated. And obviously they don't want to go about doing that all the time. So yeah, but having a full remake of it would be nice. I don't know if I believe that Resident Evil Code Veronica will get a full-on remake. I wouldn't be surprised if any sort of HD re-release of that game exists. But, we'll see, because obviously Resident Evil 2 Remake has absolutely killed it. Like, people are just in love with it. But then again, it's a remake of the single most popular game of the franchise. So there was logic behind that. If Resident Evil 3 Remake does as well, or at least close to, then I could see them doing a Code Veronica remake, just to kind of complete the nostalgia. But it doesn't really need it, because it's basically on par visually with Resident Evil 0 and Resident Evil 1. So then you're starting to get into, like, do we remake those again? You know what I'm saying? So I don't know if they would bother. But Resident Evil 3 is at least pretty much inevitable to see that. But that said, Code Veronica should at least get some sort of HD re-release, because I think the last version of it we got was a digital-only Xbox 360 version. Although I believe in certain parts of Asia, they got a physical edition of it, but it's region locked, so it's whatever. And I think it was in Japanese only specifically. So yeah, that is not of really any use here. But that said, yeah, if they were to do some sort of like the way they did those random physical editions of Xbox or for Xbox One and PS4 of Resident Evil 4, 5, and 6, yeah, give me one of those with Code Veronica, complete X edition, whatever you want to call it. Maybe I don't think there's any sort of DLC or anything you could put into it, but yeah, I would totally be down for that. And it's kind of surprising that when they did Origins Collection, they didn't throw that on there. But maybe that's because it's Origins and that would be a huge skip over. I don't know. Code Veronica is like oddly placed in the timeline because it's sandwiched in between when they did all the newer generation of Resident Evil games and the older ones that they've had to remake. It's just kind of there in the middle. Like, it's not really a relic per se, but it's just an oddball out. But yeah, that said, it's still a great game, of course. Now, moving on, last subject that we're going to talk about here is the closure of Machinima. Now, I've been working with Machinima for years, so I know people have had their beef with them and their history with them and all that. You know, I've had individual incidents where I was like, this was handled very oddly, etc. But, you know, I really liked the people who worked there and that were on staff, and they would send me little care packages from time to time, and they'd send me random games from time to time. And I always enjoyed working with them. You know, they got me some jobs every once in a while and opportunities. So I will miss them. But yeah, it's just upsetting to an extent. But at the same time, a whole bunch of my content that was up on their main channel is now inaccessible, and I've tried requesting it, and I'm not really getting anywhere with that. So that's annoying. But has it affected me? Yes, to an extent. Not as much this channel yet, because this channel wasn't signed with Machinima. But yeah, it has had an effect on my life. Let's just put it that way. So I want to say I doubt that anybody at Machinima was ever going to hear this, but, you know, I'll miss you guys, miss the work you did. I know you guys had a bad rap, and to everybody out there who, you know, never worked with them but just assumed they were terrible based on some reputation, their problem was always that they were a revolving door company. You know, somebody would come in with a good idea, and then, you know, it wouldn't really get anywhere, and then they'd be out the door like 6 months later. So occasionally you'd have someone come in with a bad idea, and then they'd enforce it, and then they'd be gone, but their bad idea stuck around. So that was Machinima's big problem, is that they're just people who weren't there long enough, and the people who were there long enough didn't have the kind of influence necessary to be able to make serious changes. And it's just, you know, just what kind of happened over time. So I'll miss a lot of that. And let's just put it this way: thank you guys very much for being Patreon backers, because it's now pretty essential, more than it has been. So thank you so much. So with that said, I want to thank again to everybody who gets a shout out here. Of course, Justin Webb, Corey Marsh, Jesse Perez, Joseph Tamburino, Luis Bonilla, Michael Kelly, Eric Perales, Trey Wagner, Tim Inman, the rest of you guys who just support me on Patreon and just listen to this just to listen to it. And of course, everybody who watches this on the channel is listening to it just to watch it on the channel. I appreciate all of you very much. Thank you very much for watching, or listening in this case, and I'll see you all later.